経営という名前のgovernment we have courtesy we have Kurita. So emotionally assistance with the international community standards and called the establishment of a nation for refugees currently underpopulated but habitable area. It's an 8 paragraph of
As members of a developed country, we are very lucky, but every day we see in the news developing people, refugees being rejected on the shore, refugees dying, refugees sinking in boats, thousands of children dying every day at sea because countries cannot accept them and they are left to die there in the Mediterranean, things like that, right? This can all be solved if the countries did have a place to actually put these refugees. The countries did have a way of actually saving these people. And these children, these parents, and these families may actually have a proper life and a proper way of subsistence if they actually had a place to go. Government side is actually going to offer you a plausible solution as to how we can save these refugees and save all their lives. We're going to do that through 2 main points. First of all, we're going to talk about the urgency of the refugee crisis right now and exactly why it is happening. But secondly, we're going to talk about why as an international community, we have a duty to do this, but furthermore, why it is most effective. Before that, let's go into the most important thing coming from today, from the government side, the model, right? So we think that, first of all, we think that when we say habitable places, we're talking about places that are largely underpopulated, that have almost 0.1 per people per square kilometer, which is places like Greenland. Places like Iceland, Suriname, in South America, Australia, Morocco, right? This is the only research I've done. So we think that it's we're not going to leave them in places like, for example, the middle of the freaking like Sahara Desert or something, but places which may be a little cold, which may be a little hot, but are very habitable, that have jobs, that have a very large potential of actually accepting these people. But furthermore, right, we think that just because this is going to happen, it doesn't mean that places like the United States and the UK are completely going to stop taking refugees. Now, why is this? It's because the idea of wanting to save others, helping others, is something innate in the human characterizations. But furthermore, countries like the US give so much to foreign aid because it's an integral part of what the democratic liberal process is. So we think that despite there being this kind of country, the US actually will still continue to accept refugees. The UK will still as well. And we think that's going to be crazy if they propose that, right? But furthermore, we think that this debate is whether or not all the refugees should go into this country, but furthermore, the overflowing refugees, the ones that currently are rejected and have no place to go, where should we put them and what should we do with them? And we propose this new nation. But furthermore, what is this money going to be made up of? This money is going to be proportionate to the economic well-being and the GDP of each of the countries. But furthermore, it's going to be used to make things like infrastructure, things like industries, economic industries, political institutions, and economic institutions, things like inputting a proper judiciary law system within that nation, right? But furthermore, we want to make something clear here. It is not okay for the opposition side to come up here and say that we have to defend something like Israel. Israel is a very specific case where they happen to actually place those kinds of refugees in a very secret, religious spot, the only religious spot for almost all Catholics, all Christians, all Islamic people, and many other religions, right? So it's very, very not possible. It's actually impossible because there's no other location like that in the world other than Israel, right? So it's very unlikely that that large crisis that is currently going on right now is going to happen. So we're going to explain to you exactly why through 2 main points.
So you say that UK and US is sort of nice for humanitarian peace. Why are people rejected in the first place?
That's my first point. So first of all, urgency of the refugee crisis, right? Currently in the status quo, EU is taking less asylum seekers, and Japanese people are rejecting 40 asylum seekers or refugees every single year, right? The reason for this is because the people within that country want to help these people. However, they don't want them in their own backyards, right? Meaning the fact that they don't want these people to come in massive figures. The reason for that is based on three main things. First of all, the idea that if they do come in, there is going to be more of a competition for jobs, which is a very important thing for these people. But secondly, things like a bit of more welfare burden, or things like the fear of the unknown, and in very rare cases, things like right-wing people who believe in not accepting refugees, right? So we think that what happens because of this is two main things. The fact that they must return to their original country because of and by doing that, what they do is that they have to face persecution again. They have to face oppression again, and they have to actually be killed again. They have to be killed, right? We think that in that way, the reason that this these refugee crisis is happening is because of the fact that the people don't want them in their country and then don't want them stealing their jobs, right? However, this whole nation actually completely solves that problem, right? Because these people aren't going to be in that nation. They're not going to be taking their jobs because they have their own nation. We think that because of this, what will happen in the aftermath is two main things, right? First of all, we think that, we think that political institutions will be built within that country. We think what the opposition side today is going to come up here and say is the fact that the political institutions aren't going to work because these people are so vastly different and they're so vastly diverse, right? We understand that there's going to be a diversity of ethnicity, with a diversity of, for example, political ideologies. However, we think that these people who are refugees understand what it's like to be persecuted, understand what it's like to go and almost face life and death every single day, right? We think that because of that, they're going to be a lot willing to understand each other even more. They're going to be a lot willing to actually comply with each other's needs a lot more. Like, for example, how the USA was started at the very beginning of the US formation, right? But furthermore, even if, for example, that willingness to connect is not going to be there, the fear of actually being a refugee again, the fear of actually not having a place to go again, will actually help these people want to develop this nation and maintain it so they actually have a place to stay, so they don't have to be the ones on the boats dying in the middle of the sea like they were before. But furthermore, as an international community, why do we want to actually do this? First of all, as an international community, you have a role to provide or prevent an effective measure for the current humanitarian crises, right? We think this is a basic principle which is written on, for example, the UN Charter and almost every single United Nations thing, right? And it's because of the fact that as an international community, we must take an effective measure for the general well-being of the people. How is this going to happen? What is this clearly right now, right? In the current status quo, there's a very large collective action problem because of the fact that each country is autonomously choosing how many refugees they want. This leads to two main problems, right? First of all, the actor of each country wants less because of domestic pressures, right? But furthermore, even if you're a willing state like Hungary, like Sweden, like Austria, the capacity for these people or these countries is reaching the limit right now. And because of very practical reasons like welfare, like things like subsistence, they are unable to accept these people or being forced to actually deport these refugees. This is not going to happen in this country because of the fact that this is eventually going to be a self-subsistent country. Because companies are going to invest in this, because there's going to be proper economic and financial institutions, because of the fact that these people will have proper jobs, we think that this will lead to a better nation. At the end of the day, every single problem of the refugee crisis is going to be solved by having a nation where these people can actually go. And you can save that 5-year-old boy just dying in the sea in a boat right now. We're very happy to vote.
Thank you for your speech. Then I'd like to invite the video with you here.
In their initial stages, but gradually lose support as the infeasibilities and problem fail. We'll give you 2 examples of what was likely to happen under their current. So the first example we'll give you is Liberia, right? So people from the United States, Black Americans, went into a region in Africa and created their own country there. At the very start, it was a very good policy, right? It was as ideal as they said, proving all of the racial problems that the United States has. It even had support from white philanthropists. But it was doomed to fail because the people there did not get along with the people who originally lived there, but also they fought internally, and the economy was unsustainable, and it was doomed to fail, right? But secondly, we'll give you also the example of Nauru Island, right? So right now, a lot of the refugees who come to Australia are quartered off to an island in the Pacific and forced to live there and stay there in horrendous conditions where there's minimal healthcare, where there's limited food, which is pretty much a prison, because this is what exactly happens to these policies, right? Nauru Island, however, by the perception of the Australian people, is a paradox because we're giving these refugees food and homes, and it's completely fine for them to be there. But that's not the truth, right? We, on our side of the house, believe that this attempt does not work, and does not only work, but it also weakens our ability to help these refugees in the places that we actually need to help them, and prevent us from returning and repatriating these refugees, instead of imprisoning them in this country. That does not work. What do we want under our side of the house? We want status quo plus, right? We would put all of the money, the huge amounts of sums that they have to create permanent industries there, into refugee camps or inducements to help other states accept refugees into their land. Our burden, however, is not to show you that status quo is bad or worse. What we need to show you, we agree that it's bad, right? But what we need to show you is that this measure, their side, is likely to fail and is going to be worse under their side of the house. So what are we going to talk about? 2 main things. Firstly, we're going to talk about why this nation is highly likely to fail by analyzing where this nation is going to be and what kind of people are going to be there. But secondly, we're also going to analyze how this impedes other more important movements for the health of refugees. Before that, 2 things to point out for their side of the house. First thing is that the reason that they said that developed nations do not currently accept refugees, the collective action home, stuff like that, will occur on their side of the house too, which means that their policy will not work in the long run because all those problems that they just talked about will also occur for this country, and therefore states will no longer support this policy either way, right? And also that means that they will no longer accept other refugees if they create this country because they'll think, we have this country already, therefore we don't need to accept more refugees into ours. Secondly, notice that Saika said very little in terms of how this policy is going to work, except for the feelings of the people involved. They never really analyzed how exactly this country is going to be self-sufficient, how exactly the government is going to work, and we're going to tell you exactly why it will not, right? So let's go to the first point. Why is this motion, and why is this country likely to fail? So firstly, let's talk about where this country is likely to be, right? They said Greenland. There's a reason that these places are underpopulated when there's 7 billion people on this earth. And the reason is that there's few resources in these places, it's very far from major industries, it's very far from ports, and it's very hard to create a sustainable country there. And there are very few industries in the first place, right? It's habitable, but it's just barely habitable, and that's why jobs simply don't grow up from the ground, right? So, and also, if they be it in helping propping up this nation, even if they do so, in the long term, this is likely to fail, because philanthropists care about a lot of different things, right? So in the start, this country might be cool and new and awesome, and they might put a lot of money into it to the start, but gradually they lose interest, right? They don't care about refugees anymore. Now it's the economy, now it's the environment. They put money into different things, and now they don't care about these refugees, which means that the economic help and the resources they give to this place in the first place will gradually fade out. And when it does, we don't think it's likely that this industry is going to be, that this place is going to be economically viable because it doesn't have the resources, and even if it has people, it doesn't have the capacity to create this rotating industry when they haven't analyzed how that's going to happen. But secondly, whose land is it going to be, right? We think this is unfair for sovereignty as well, because this country has to be somewhere, and when 192 countries dominate the entire landmass of the earth, where is it that there's going to create this country? This is unfair to the sovereignty of the places of the country they're going to create this country. Anyway, so they can't argue Turkey is being unfairly treated right now, or Lebanon is being unfairly treated, because that's exactly what they're going to be doing as well. Second, so who is actually going to be in these nations, right? When we talk about refugees, we're not simply talking about Syrian refugees who are crossing the Mediterranean right now. We're talking about people from all sorts of places, right? We're talking about Syrian refugees, but also we're talking about refugees, Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. We're also talking about people from Somalia. We're talking about people from Sudan. They all speak completely different languages, right? There's no single way for all of these people to be able to communicate with each other, and they have completely different cultures, they have completely different religions, they're from completely different backgrounds, they wear completely different clothing, they eat completely different food. They cannot simply understand each other because they are so different to start with. You can't just blankly say refugees will get along because they're nice and they want to escape fast, right? So why would a Christian refugee government with a refugee from Myanmar who doesn't understand their language but also doesn't really like Christians because the Christians were the ones persecuting them back in Myanmar, right? We don't think that this policy can simply work in that way. So that is why this is likely to lead to internal conflict and possibly governmental failure, right? Because like they're going to hate each other if they're stuck in this place and they can't escape, and this is the only way for them to live. That means there's going to be more internal conflict, and who's to say that there won't be stuff like terrorism when these people realize that it's the West and it's the rich countries who are subjecting them to this horrible situation. So therefore, the conclusion of this analysis is that this state will fail. And if it does, we think it's likely actually that refugees will now want to escape this place too, right? So there will now be another exodus of refugees away from this place, which means that you don't solve the problem of refugees under your side of the house as well.
So you said the international community will not have any or little incentive, regardless of NIMBY psychology and not human barrier psychology. But in that case, how can you sustain your case of like spending for refugees?
Yes, because you guys can, right? Okay, so, and notice also on their side of the house, when the status quo, when most refugees die crossing the Mediterranean, this is actually going to happen under their side of the house as well, right? So even if the state works perfectly, huge numbers of refugees would die trying to make the journey, because if you had the capacity to ferry everyone to this state, to this ideal state, then you would also have the capacity to provide food and aid to people in the refugee camps, like in these regions, right? Therefore, the conclusion is regardless of the success or failure of the state, huge numbers of refugees are going to die under their side of the house, which is rich for them to say that we're going to be the same refugees under their side of the house, right? So secondly, how does this impede other more important movements, right? Because we think in comparison to the failure of this state, our side is able to get, like, we are able to provide these refugees with their family, provide them the ability to practice their religion within these refugee camps, and we say that's comparatively better. But this motion prevents that for two reasons. Firstly, because it splits the power of refugee aid agencies like the UNHCR and the NGOs, and therefore that means less resources go to these refugee camps. But secondly, it also means that now they have a rhetoric, right? Because these refugees have a state. They don't need any more help. We don't need to help them. And that's exactly the thing that causes the NIMBY ideology under their side of the house. We're supremely proud to oppose this horrible.
Thank you for the speech. Then I'd like to invite Vicky to participate.
Mr. Speaker, so what I'm going to do in my substantive is to further analyze what's going to happen in the after plan, how this state is going to be successful under our policy. But before that, let me engage with what the previous speaker said. Now, first, it's just an assertion that, for example, there are some failed examples, Mr. Speaker, like Liberia, because like most of the examples that they cited were the cases where there was no support from the global community, and at the very least, Liberia was a primary example that failed due to the lack of support, Mr. Speaker. We think that applies for the example except for Liberia, and definitely think that was like grossly misrepresenting our model, because the motion says we are going to plan and support the establishment of a new nation, which is a crucial difference from the examples that they provided at the beginning of their speech. Now, in their reflection, they just asserted that, Mr. Speaker, that the lack of incentive is going to remain under our policy, and therefore that's not going to be the difference. But, Mr. Speaker, they totally missed the nuance coming from Saiga's speech. We are not saying that the countries, Mr. Speaker, for example, the West, have no incentive to support, for example, people in need. What we are saying is that in a particular situation where they have to accept those people in their own backyard, they do not have an incentive. And therefore, it's just an assertion to say, Mr. Speaker, that things are not going to change, because they totally didn't listen to the analysis about in what circumstance the countries do not have an incentive, Mr. Speaker. We say that since there will be no competition of jobs, for example, there's no fear that jobs are going to be stolen by the refugees who work at the very who work even with a bad farm, for example, low salary. Those competition is not going to it's not going to happen, because simply they are residing in another state which is different from their own backyard, and therefore we don't think there will be domestic backlash against this policy, and that is a crucial difference, because people are not going to be deprived of their jobs. Furthermore, we think the first argument it does not make any sense because it wasn't really comparative with, for example, their situation, the situation of refugees which happened under their proposal, because they're basically faced with the persecution and oppression every single day. Because the criteria for refugees, as we all know, is extremely strict, Mr. Speaker. Just with like economic, for example, like poverty, those people are not like eligible as refugees in many circumstances. It has to be either mass starvation, but in the vast majority of cases, it is something to do with conflict, Mr. Speaker, or the persecution in their original state. And therefore, it is very realistic to say they are facing the risk of death every single day. And therefore, none of the analysis stands comparing to the reality which happens under their proposal, that they are going to be persecuted or living with the fear of death every single day, Mr. Speaker. Now, but how do you say that? Let me engage with the logic that this is going to fail, because we think this is going to be pretty successful, or hugely, we are going to have a reasonable improvement compared to the situation of the status quo, Mr. Speaker. Now, it's just a lie to say that there is no resource which could be used in the new states, because in places like Greenland, we know that there is a resource like oil in the states around Greenland. That it is factually wrong to say there are no resources which can be utilized around the states which we are going to create. And furthermore, in addition to those natural resources, we are going to, the term habitable means, Mr. Speaker, it does not just mean that geographically they can be there, because if that's the criteria, that's the definition of habitable, every single place is going to be habitable if they can just be geographically there. It does mean that, for example, there are crops or there is a food so that people can sustain their lives, Mr. Speaker. That is the definition of the term habitable, and therefore this means that people are going to produce crops, people are going to sell it to other people, and therefore by that they are going to create profits, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, for example, some people, this is what happens in the after plan. But some people are going to create crops, and they are going to sell those crops to the other people, and those other people are going to sell another crop which are also necessary for the subsistence of their country, and therefore they are going to exchange that, and they are going to make profits. That's how they are going to create the industry, Mr. Speaker, or the investment to the resources in the case of Greenland and the other places with natural resources. That's how they are going to create their own industry, and further we are going to expect the investment coming from the outside. That's how they are going to create the country and make the economy work under our proposal. And therefore that's what happens. We don't think that's going to be a massive failure, Mr. Speaker. And also they seem to insinuate that there are going to be conflicts because we have lots of diversity in the new states. Let me give you some successful examples, Mr. Speaker. Because actually the vast majority of cases where there is diversity of ethnicity or race, we see a successful state. Although there are some problems, but it is largely successful. Like US or India, Mr. Speaker. We think it's just an assertion to say diversity automatically means conflicts. And furthermore, we analyze from Saraka that those are the people who know the importance of peace, because they are coming from a state where there are lots of conflicts. They are facing with the risk of death every single day due to the conflict, Mr. Speaker. Now, the reason why we don't think diversity means conflicts, again, we don't think so, because the reason why conflicts are happening in the original country is, for example, someone in the neighborhood is the person who killed your sisters and brothers or fathers or mothers, or for example, the community leader propagates that sort of narrative. But Mr. Speaker, they will not be influenced by that sort of narrative or by that sort of factor that, for example, someone in the neighborhood has killed their family members, because that they are going to live in a new state, and therefore they might have a different religion, they might belong to different ethnic groups. But the fact that, Mr. Speaker, the people that you're facing are the ones who have been in conflict with you, for example, for the past decades or so, that unique factor in their home country is going to disappear. That's the massive difference in terms of reduction of conflicts. So the conclusion of this issue is this: we think this new state is going to be successful because we are going to remove the problems of the status quo or the problems of their home country, Mr. Speaker, and we think at the very least this is going to be comparatively much better than the status quo where they are facing the risk of death every single day. I'll take the point.
Agrarian economies of the type that you described no longer exist in our current world, but you yourself said that you're willing to give them land in the United States of America, which is already inhabited. That is their background.
Wow. The reason why agrarian economy doesn't exist is because we have passed those stages. We are going to create a country where, Mr. Speaker, first of all, they are going to be at the stage, but with investment to their resources, or for example, things like exports of their crops, we think they are going to develop. But even if they do not develop, Mr. Speaker, we think that is much better because they are going to face the less risk of, for example, death or conflict, Mr. Speaker. We think, so we think this is also important because gradually they are going to self-subsist, Mr. speaker. And therefore, as I already said, there are differences between not in my backyard factor that happens in the status quo. For example, there's no deprivation of jobs. But in addition to that, since they're going to be self-subsistent in the long term, meaning that you don't have to rely on the monetary support or the, for example, like monetary support from the outside as a speaker, there will be no less necessity of support of fund, Mr. Speaker, from the outside to those new states, for example, in 10 or 20 years. And therefore, comparatively, they don't have to continually support them. And that's also a huge difference between the status quo and the plan, because they will not need to support them in the next decade or in the distant in the future. So we think that's also the reason why our policy is going to be successful compared to the status quo. Only no, we don't think they are going to be, they are comparative. We think we need to accept the fact that the status quo is failing right now. They are facing the risk of death every single day. We think our state is going to be successful. For those of reasons, we are extremely proud.
Thank you for the speech. I'd like to invite THBT to
One, on how this policy impedes other important attempts like refugee camps and funding for those areas. Second, once again, will this policy really work? Before that, rebuttal. So, there comes this idea that, US and UK are going to keep on supporting because they like people. But they also say that there's a collective action problem, so people aren't really fond of supporting them because other people are there to support them. So then why should we be supporting them? That just doesn't make sense, And the reason that collective action problem exists is because there are other attempts at working. There are other nations that are doing it. So why don't we just not support it? We want to prioritize ourselves. It should be like funding less. That's the status quo. That means if we create also nation, if we create this new attempt, it looks like it's working. It looks like it's okay, and we can go on with that. And that's when other nations are demotivated for accepting refugees. Turkey doesn't want to have more refugees in there. They just say that, we're not going to accept more refugees from Syria. Please go to that nation. Well, good luck with the voting or whatsoever. And because, that's how they want to deal with it. They can create this rhetoric that is a better place and you can go with it. But only to do that transportation is terrible. And of course, elaborate that nation is not really a good place. I necessarily think that a status quo is bad because of the mentalities and incentives of nations. That's the exact reason why the creation of these nations demotivate any incentive of currently existing refugee camps or any funding that goes on to other relevant areas, including this nation too. Second, they talk about how Liberia is relevant because they did not have other support. No, thank you. No, we already told you from leader of option that it had numerous supports from American philanthropists. It had global support in that moment, and it's not really that different. The second is that it's a good thing that these people went there for their aims, but because it's not really an economically sustainable area, it's that you suddenly invaded an area where people were with. You don't necessarily know the culture or the climate of that area. The economy is not going to work. You're going to have conflict in there. You might have in long-term internal conflict within your group because the aims and issues that come about, and that's how Liberia is still not really the developed country in Africa. So the same scenario happens. The same logic is there, and they will only say that it's a past. It doesn't matter, and they have to engage with all these similarities that they simply neglected. So let's go on to substantive about how this policy impedes those other attempts. So we think that nations might be good, but the most important mechanism in which the refugees are alleviated from their suffering is refugee camps. Because they are the closest areas in which they can evacuate from the conflict that they are there. Like Greenland isn't next to Syria, it's not next to Sudan. So it's the most important mechanism for people to know where to go to and be able to hide from these backlash of the conflict immediately is these refugee camps. And these refugee camps are in a really vulnerable situation, and that's why necessarily is that the amount of funding and amount of support going into refugee camps equals the capacity for more refugees to be accepted, for them to be able to avoid epidemics, to be able to avoid terrorism from coming in there, or vandalism to happen, or things like that. That means that the more you have mechanisms to have decreased support, to let more refugees in these refugee camps, are going to have more risk of those sort of conflicts, more risk of those sort of diseases, or more sort of being persecuted from the refugee camps, is because the capacity is full. So why does it lead to the decrease? We told you already a lot of mechanisms. We told you that the collective action problem applies this too. Because if you want to go to this nation, or go to it, but not that the money, there's a huge movement to create this nation. That means that NGOs who are at refugee camps, money that are going to refugee camps, probably are going to shift to creating these nations. Obviously, creating a nation takes a bulk of money. You have to create laws, you have to create industries, you have to create infrastructure, you have to hire a lot of people. You have to negotiate with these states to create a proper national border for Australia to give up certain lands and things like that. That bulk of money is no longer going to refugee camps. And that bulk of money that could be used to save people, cure diseases, and create these camps simply are lost, and why it simply is a huge decrease. But furthermore, no, I'm sure.
Okay, you said refugee camp does not cost a lot. That's because there's no job, and that's because there's no real support in the refugee camp. That's exactly why the refugee camp does not cost a lot. How is it good?
That is what I'm going to tell you in the second substantive. That in comparative, refugee camps are better than this crippled nation. So just listen on. And so I already told you that the resource goes on. But furthermore, there's a mechanism of the collective action problem. Also, the money decreases on a collective level. But furthermore, the point is that there's going to be a movement saying that because you fund the refugee camps, our ability and the momentum to fund and create this nation stronger is weaker. And that means that there's going to be bashing on movements that keep on funding and pouring money into refugee camps. And that's also going to be a loss for the establishment and sustainability of these sort of things. And why other more relevant and important movements are going to cripple more refugees dying on this side of the house. Let's go on whether their policy works. So the biggest idea from this side of the house is that kids are not going to die in the sea. But we already told you that they still unfortunately are going to die because the transportation going on to Greenland, that's a huge risk. You might not know how to go there. You might be taken away by deceived by illegal, businesses like traffickers and things like that. And that sort of risk exists. If they say that the transportation is feasible on their side of the house, I don't understand why the transportation of these people going over the Mediterranean Sea or going on to Europe and things like that is not risky even in the status quo. If they assume that it works on their side of the house, probably we can assume it works, but because that's not the reality, their transition and all the benefit of saying that they're going to be safe simply doesn't work on a general level. But furthermore, we need to understand that so if they can transport is that they can go to countries and refugee camps and they can have the decent basic living to a certain extent. And it's a comparative here, whether camps are better or whether these refugee nations are good. And it's really contingent on the economic success and sustainability. And it's really, really rusty there because, they don't have proper common languages. It's not like they're the skilled workers and that are able to speak English and are able to know business know-how and are able to build corporations. So you have these job skills. Then I don't know how these people and the collective mass of them are able to create a proper industry, create common laws there, and all the things that are necessary for a nation to sustain. All this benefits that the mechanism they provided with regard to economy was that, trading crops and sort of things, that's a very primitive sort of developing sort of thing, economy, and not sort of vision that they're telling us for a sustainable, developed sort of decent level of economy. They were never able to prove why these people's sort of interaction is able to nurture them to a sustainable level on their side of the house. It's that but furthermore, it's that because there are different religions, there are different frameworks of people understanding, there's going to be conflict. Their response is that, they're all overcome things. That's not true because in temporal refugee camps, there's no real strict law you have to break. But if it's a nation, you have to break strict laws. And where do you draw the line? It might be unfair to Muslims, it might be unfair to certain ethnicities. And that's when unique conflicts happen between these groups. Because they're going to have to be there, but these groups are arbitrary to them. They're going to be methods about what should be prioritized and a fuss about who should be more important. And that's when you have internal conflict, economy not really working. And that's probably a bit worse than refugee camps. So it's that policy doesn't work. It's worse than refugee camps. Even if it's not, it deprives other mechanisms of very close to refugee camps from being funded properly. We are proud of those.
Thank you for the speech. I'd like to invite the speaker.
So, Mr. Speaker, the opposition's paradigm was refugee camps, and the opposition's premise was that the international community doesn't generally have the incentive to help refugees only in our ways, right? If that is the premise, and we think this is based on their basic human nature analysis that human beings are generally not caring about anyone else in a humanitarian sense. So if that's the premise, then opposition cannot sustain the model. That is a basic claim I first want to put to you. So they said that the contiguity of refugees in the backyard is irrelevant. Even if the refugees are far away, we don't care. We don't care in humanitarian sense. Humans will not help them anyway. And the same mechanism is applied to our case. We're not talking about that short term, right? We are also talking about long term, and we are also talking about whether human beings or international community will keep getting incentivized to help those things. And we think we provided a nuanced analysis about why that would be violated under their paradigm, right? If they aren't talking about, no thank you. We think if those refugees aren't taking my job, for example, and not living near my house, then the humanitarian concern can still remain under our paradigm. That is the basic analysis that we provided to you. And their analysis cannot, no thank you, their analysis cannot be held in ways to be compatible with their policy that refugee camps should be sustained eternally, right? So the more serious problem is in the opposition side is this. Opposition has no perspective about two necessary purposes that we have to achieve as an international community. In the short term, refugees need to get away from the conflict zones, for example, refugee camps, but it's not safe at all, right? Guerrilla soldiers operating a terrorist creeping around, and there's no short-term good in that refugee camp. If they are much far away from that area, they can be more safer in short term. And also long term, we have provided to you that refugees need to self-sustain, right? They need to be able to produce by themselves and sustain themselves, right? We think there's no perspective in the opposition side on this point, right? They are saying the international community has to help them living in the refugee camps, and international community has to spend as long as they are residing there, and the international community has to spend on it. We think it is clear which is more sustainable, right? So there are two things I want to talk about in my speech. No, thank you. Firstly, the opposition's framework, whether it's effective to achieve both the short-term prevention of death of refugees and the long-term subsistence of refugees. And secondly, I'm going to talk about our framework. No, thank you. The complaints will be responded there. So, firstly, there was no substantive from leader of opposition about their own framework. She just said, refugee camps. Right? So, we have analyzed the status quo. The advanced nations are either unwilling to accept the refugees or incapable anymore because of collective action program. And they said, so let's send them to refugee camps. And they acknowledged that in refugee camps, they cannot sustain themselves. They acknowledged, and the international community sustained them, right? So they said international community should spend on that, right? So we think the refugee camps have three problems. Firstly, there's no job and no support, right? And secondly, those camps are not really free from the battles, right? They are nearer to the areas in which conflicts are going on. And thirdly, it is just temporary. They admitted this, right? It is just temporary, and the refugees are expected to go somewhere else. And that movement itself is dangerous for them, right? So why? Then why are they comparing this refugee camp stuff with our policy, with the settled settling of those refugees in one area. So they have proven that by saying this is just temporary, and by saying there's no job, no support, they have proven that their model does not have any prospect about long-term self-sustenance of these refugees themselves. No, thank you. So actually, let's see.
So how many refugees is your supposed nation going to be able to accept?
Again, please.
How many refugees is your supposed nation going to be able to accept?
No, it's not about acceptance. Right, I couldn't understand it. So, right, our framework. They have complained first that Liberia, etc., it has been unsuccessful. So they just have thrown the facts and that are interesting, but mechanism must be explained, right? So that case was not really a model of this motion, right? Model of our side, no thank you. It is not international community which has supported Liberia, right? They just said United States, and our model is not being forced in that case, right? Only the United States, and that's why we think that is the exact reason why the United States couldn't keep the support for Liberia, right? Because of the collective action problem. That the United States had to bear the burden of supporting Liberia by itself, right? It is not international community supporting the United States. It's not the international community supporting the Liberia. It is just the United States. And this is exactly matching our analysis about why does one nation or the individual nation will be unable or unincentivized or will be incapable of keeping support for these things, right? So the willingness of international community has been explained under our paradigm, right? Our policy is about enforcement of equilibrium of those expected utilities for each country, right? When confirmed that all members of the international community is similarly doing the contribution to the refugees, then each country can reduce the pressure within itself, right? They just said that if this support is shifted from camps to nations, then the motivation will go down. Now the camp funding is more likely to get camp funding is less and less likely to get support under their paradigm. Because they have no jobs in refugee camps, right? And they cannot sustain themselves. And then the international community, or for example, United States maybe, has to support them economically and financially. So there's no perspective for self-subsistence. And the reason why the citizens of the United States will go against this policy is because there's no long-term perspective about self-sustenance of those refugees. And for those reasons, they will just doesn't stand. They have complaints, but they have nothing substantive.
Thank you for your speech. I'd like to invite questions there.
Oppressed by the Nazis in Germany, but there's now oppressing the Palestinian people. We think that those examples shows that just because they shared oppression, that doesn't mean that they can even suddenly become friends. We think that they have different nationality, they have different ideology, they have different religion and language. It's impossible for people to suddenly become friends and form a nation. We think this is a bizarre idea. So I'm gonna look at three things in my speech. So firstly, I want to look at was this country actually be able to work? And secondly, I want to look at how many people I want to look at can this country actually seek save more people in the case of like movement, and thirdly, I want to look at which is a much more efficient way, and which can actually save more people efficiently. But before that, our invitation to their side of the house. So firstly, they bashed our they said that refugee camps don't really work because firstly, there's no jobs in refugee camp. It's not sustainable. Blah blah blah. Well, firstly, we think that refugee economy actually exists in those refugee camps. For example, in Kenya, the Congo refugee actually have agriculture or those kind of things are occurring in the status quo. So we don't think that's true. But we think that we think that because it's temporarily, we think that actually creates a notion that we have to tackle to the core part of the conflict existing. For example, those refugees doesn't really want to live in USA or other nations. They usually want to go back to their home nation. That's what they first prioritize. So we think that since it is temporary, that's how there's a notion that there is international people. We think that this dire necessity actually makes people the countries have more incentive to actually tackle to their problem. And thirdly, we think that refugee camp is something that is most important and to actually save those people, because refugee camp, if there is less refugees camp, those people are not able to actually move or actually escape from that nation because there is no place that even if it's temporarily, at least those people can get away from the very dangerous situation under the conflict. And their side, we already told you that how refugee camps are likely to decrease because now they're going to put so much money into this nation. They have to build infrastructure from zero where there's no pipelines or they have to create roads. We think that kind of money will not go to the refugees camp, and we think that people are not gonna even get out of the country, or even if they're trying to get out, they have to die because of moving to a refugee camp that's so far away. We think that problem exists in their side. No, thank you. So first, I want to look at, does this country actually be able to work? So the only argument that they talked about, because is that those people are able to unite because they share the pain. For example, let's look at USA. Well, firstly, USA, when it was established, it was not diverse at all. There were only Anglo-Saxon white people with Christian background. So we think that it wasn't diverse. That's why they were able to unite, and they fought against Native Americans, and they were able to have land. So firstly, that example is not true. And secondly, they talked about India. Oh, India's diverse, but they're able to form a nation. Well, in cases of India, even if it has diverse ethnicity, there's a very big majority of Hindu people and small minority of Muslim people. Because the Hindu people have overwhelming power in India, that's why it are so powerful. It's not conflicts are going to occur because the Hindu Muslim people are not so stupid enough to actually start a fight. We think this example can also apply to, for example, Iraq. When Saddam Hussein was actually governing Iraq, because Saddam Hussein was so powerful in Iraq, there wasn't really much of a big conflict. But because now there's a battle happening in Iraq when Saddam Hussein actually was killed. Now there's a vacuum in Iraq. Now there's so much conflict in Iraq. ISIS appears. We think those kind of things is likely to happen because we told you that refugees come from diverse nations. And we think that refugees, they actually want to have the law that they came from. If someone comes from an Islam country, Sharia law was something that was fundamental to them, and they think that's something normal. But there are other people who come from other nations who want to have this kind of law, this kind of democratic system, or those kind of things. We think they all have their own opinions. We don't understand how things would actually work. Yes, sir.
The refugees are the ones who are the victims of conflicts, and they came from the conflict zones to escape from that. Why would they want conflict on our island?
Well, firstly, even if they don't want to have conflict, that doesn't mean that they don't want to have a life that they actually prefer. For example, they want to protect their religious ideology. We think religious ideology is something fundamental for most people. They're willing to die for religious ideology in a lot of nations. We think that's why they even start wars in the first place. So we think what they said does not really stand. So we think that our side is at least better because at least some countries we think that some countries at least do accept those refugees. They said that those refugees does not have any place to go, but if because no one accepts them. But there are places, for example, like Turkey that accepts them, and we think that we actually pay Turkey a lot of resource money to ask for Turkey to persuade Turkey to accept them, and we think those systems are occurring, and we think that conflict does not really occur to that extent because law is already established, and it's not like people are going to start a fight in Turkey because there is a majority of Turkish people. Secondly, they talked about how in their side the country are going to work because there's going to be rich resources and everything's going to be okay. Well, if it's rich resources, we don't think that Green would actually be willing to give that land. So because it's the rich resources, it's also beneficial for Greenland. So we can assume that there's nothing there. The soil is very not rich, and there's bad productivity. There's no infrastructure, no education system. We think that in our side, we think that since it's not there, there's already a fundamental base. At least we're able. We think our side is much more efficient. We're very happy to oppose.
Thank you for your speech. That is now the speaker. Yeah.
All they say is that we have no alternative. What's the status quo? But yeah, well, we don't have a clear alternative, and this road is unfortunately good. But what we're telling you is that if it's an attempt that makes the road more good, if it's an attempt that wastes more money, it's an attempt that does not necessarily save these people, it's an attempt that's worse, an attempt that we should not do, but the status quo is comparatively better. Saying that status quo is awful doesn't win you the debate. You have to prove that this new mechanism that takes a lot of resources, a lot of incentive of people, will improve the situation. Two things. One, on which saves more refugees. Second, on which provides a better environment for refugees. So, I think that we had a clash between about the incentive of nations like US and UK. But the thing is, I think the conclusion is that embassy has this charity with a limited resource. And it's that where you allocate that, how you utilize that is important. And what they aren't really clear about is that their nation uses the bulk of resource. It has to create infrastructure, you have to create new laws, you have to buy the land from these nations, and all those sort of costs exist. And that cost could have been used to create a refugee camp. It could have been used to just pay and feed these people in a developed nation where you don't have to necessarily build infrastructure. And it's not really clear whether they can save so many refugees in their land. There was no response to why saying that. How many refugees can they accept? How will this nation work? Will this nation will continue to accept? If it's going to go, probably these nations are going to start refusing refugees. Then they're going to invest a lot of bulk of money in there, but it's not really clear whether it's going to be saved or the situation is going to improve. But it's clear that the money could have been invested to the environment of the status quo to sustain and help these people from escaping from the conflict at stake. And at least because you lose the capacity for NGOs to go in there, money is going to be shifted to this area. So we're bashing and the collective action problem of the tokenistic nations there. So it's probably getting better. So we should fund less those sort of things was not engaged. Then at least decreases, and that means our capacity to put more money in and save one more refugee. If this decrease, and when it's going to save more refugees, numerical level, we think we are better in funding and helping the environment for at least one more, probably more thousand people after all. But let's go on to second level, on the environment. It's that, well, status quo is bad. People are drowning. People are really in a bad environment, refugee camp. People are wandering in areas because they're not accepted. But it's that they drown people more because they have to go to a certain random area that's pretty far from the conflict areas there. They haven't proven whether their nation is going to work. It might be worse than refugee camp. They haven't proven whether these infrastructures are better or those sort of things. They haven't proven why conflict actually improve. Because on level of sustainability, PM says it'll work. Companies invest, financial institutions, wow. DPM, crops, trading. Then, I don't know, magical mechanism, developed economy. Wow, it's got with no one answers at all with regard to economy. Then it ends with crop trading. That's worse than refugee camp. That's Africa. Wow, that's not even an economy, 101. I don't really understand why it's going to be there. It doesn't say poor. That leads to conflicts, that leads to hatred within the group because the nation is terrible. And that's the only conclusion that was able to prove. Conflict. The only mechanism they tell us is that Puritans going to America, they were awesome. Like, they're all white. That's a really different story. We're talking about people with different languages, different skin, different backgrounds that are all tired and fatigued by all the things that they're coming. And they're locals who have invaded of their land, who are really going to be angry about it. People who are seeing that their sovereign land was taken like an Australian region. There's going to be people really, really angry. There's going to be internal rules. And refugee camps, don't need to create rules. This place needs to create rules, and there's going to be unfair. There's not going to be a clear conclusion there. Then people are going to be dissatisfied about it. I don't know what's going to go on. And all these seeds of sentiment uniquely exist, no engagement on their side of the house. They're going to be poor, they're going to be suffocating. And that's the first myth that the Burmese tradition that they're going to burn. Because we're only able to create, we're the only team to create these realistic mechanisms there, the conclusion is that it's that status quo bad. But this attempt at least makes people burn more. It's that this land is not really going to work. It just invades a certain place and deprives of people of opportunities of their future. So, status quo is not good, but it's at least there.
Speech, finally, I walk out and speak up.
Mr. Speaker, notice how the opposition reply was unable to actually back his claims of giving you mechanisms because of the fact that there were no logic, there was no mechanism, right? Government side from the very beginning has given you a realistic paradigm as to how exactly we will build these economies, how we will integrate these people. So let's review that in this debate. So first of all, let's give the clash as to why there is a current refugee problem. We told you that it's mainly rooted from the collective action problem, and that is rooted from the idea of the I don't want them in my backyard kind of mindset, right? From the very beginning, the problem with this is that they conceded to all of our harms, right? They said that yes, people do have this mindset. Yes, people are afraid of getting their jobs taken. Yes, they are afraid of having their welfare taken. But what are you doing on your side? You're saying that you're going to increase refugees even more in that country. You're going to actually make that problem even worse and worse, right? But furthermore, what you said is that suddenly we're going to have refugee camps, because refugee camps are so fantastic, right? Now, this is a very funny counter-proposal, considering that refugee camps are one of the most criticized entities in the developed nations, right? Why is that? It's because, first of all, as they repeated in their own speeches like 10 times, refugees are a very temporary problem. Meaning the fact that if you are a refugee going into a refugee camp, you have to always leave that refugee camp in a set amount of time, right? Meaning the fact that what happens is that these refugee camps only have two possibilities for these people. First of all, you have to go back to your own state home, as we have told you, but furthermore, you have to go to a new state. But as they said, new states aren't accepting you, right? And then you can't go back to that means you have to go back to your home state, meaning the fact that you have to go back and get killed or become a refugee again. That's leading to the refugee crisis exactly, right? So basically what they have shown is that refugee camps with their tents, with their no jobs, with their no security, with their no police is so awesome. We said this all in our web speaker, guys. So why is it so awesome? Why is a temporary solution so much better than our permanent solution, right? Because what have we told you from the very beginning? This is going to be a very permanent solution. Because Anime Chan basically spent 7 minutes reviewing examples. She gave you the idea of Libya. Libya was made when there was slavery and discrimination in the United States, meaning that the United States didn't want to even give them any money, right? If you look at things like the little tiny island on the coast of somewhere, I don't even see that island, meaning it's a very small minority. But you see places like Singapore, you see places like Malaysia, you see places like India, Thailand. They were all made from different people with different languages, different ethnicities, different religions, but they all came together to develop properly, right? Now, let's look at the two harms that they actually accuse us of. First of all, the idea of the fact, what are we going to do about sovereignty? It's a new state, okay? They have their own sovereignty. But secondly, the idea of different people and different cultures. So first of all, that's exactly why we are giving them money. This is exactly why we're giving them human resources. So we can teach them English, so we can give them educational institutions, so they have a way to communicate with each other, so they have a way to actually integrate with each other, right? But two main points. First of all, political systems. 2 points we said from the beginning. So first of all, political institutions. So they said, oh my god, people are going to fight in politics. Yes, people fight in politics. That happens everywhere, right? But we think that these people people, considering the fact that they come from a background where they don't understand the feeling of being oppressed. They understand the feeling of living life or death every day, will have some incentive to cooperate, A, because they don't want to go back to that situation and see their new nation fail, or B, because of the general human compassion that they have. But secondly, the idea of our economic systems failing. We told you that yes, and it might be crops, it might be things that are very basic, which they make fun of, like Africa, right? We say that despite that, it's better than having no job. It's better than having no economy, right? But furthermore, we said that companies have an incentive to invest in this. Like they do invest in almost all developing countries, this is new labor, this is actually a cheaper labor force in developed countries, and because of that, they will have an incentive to actually help develop this. At the end of the day, this must be a comparative debate. We're not saying it's going to be a perfect utopia, but it will be better than you going to refugee camp and being left to die there after a few months. It is going to be better than you having no place to go whatsoever, and at the end of the day, it is going to be comparatively better than any solution that they have given us in their 21-minute speech, and for that reason, we're very happy to oppose.